Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'll be showing you how to assemble the pattern I created for a men's vest. There are versions of this pattern for Iplehouse EID and SID. Let's jump right in. We're going to start by pinning the darts in the front pieces of the vest, both the lining and the main body fabric. These are curved darts, which gives a beautiful fit, and aren't as hard to pin and sew as they look. You'll fold the pieces in half along the dart, but keep it loose. Slide a pin in one side along the line, then make sure it comes out through the line on the other side. It's best to start at the inner corner and work your way down to the edge of the fabric, because that gives you more room to flex the material. Once all the pieces are pinned, you'll want to sew along the darts, backstitching at the bottom edge. At the inner corner, instead of backstitching, you'll want to knot the thread by hand. You can do this by tying a loop for a single knot and then pulling the knot down to the fabric with a pin, or you can just knot the two threads together. Repeat this for all 4 pieces. The next thing we'll do is construct the lining. Take the 2 back pieces of the lining and place them right sides together. Pin along the center back, which is just slightly curved. Sew the 2 pieces together, backstitching at both ends of the seam. Then take the front lining pieces and put them against the completed back with right sides together, pinning them at the shoulder. You'll sew both shoulders closed, backstitching at both ends of each seam. Then the lining is complete. Trim all your threads when you're done. We'll take this to the ironing board for a good pressing in a second, but we have a few more pieces to put together first. Take the back strap pieces and fold them in half, pinning them closed. You'll backstitch at the edge, sew down one long side, then turn and sew one end closed, backstitching at the end there too. Trim your threads and clip the corners of the finished end so it will turn more easily. Then turn the piece right side out. I use the handle of a paintbrush to help. Sew both straps this way. Now we'll start assembling the outer shell, which is made with our main fabric. Pin the two back pieces together, just like the lining, and sew down the center seam. Make sure you backstitch at the ends so it won't pull apart. Next, we'll be creating welt pockets. Start by creating your guide for the welt. Patterns normally include a guide, but I've left the welt pocket piece on my pattern blank so that you can custom tailor it to the size of pocket you want. If you don't want a pocket, or you're not confident enough to tackle this yet, it's not necessary. You can skip it altogether, or just fold in the edges of a welt piece to create a false pocket on the front of your vest. You'll begin by determining how wide you want your pocket to be. Leave at least 1/4 of an inch to either side of the pattern piece, so that you have a proper seam allowance. Then you'll mark the center point vertically and horizontally. You can do this by folding the piece in half and marking along each crease. From there, you need to determine how wide you want your welt to be. I want mine to be a 1/2 inch tall, so I draw a stitching guide 1/4 of an inch to either side of the center line, which will be the pocket opening. You can do wider or smaller, but you shouldn't go any smaller than 1/8 of an inch, or the fabric will fray. Last of all, create guidelines connecting the corners of the stitching lines to the center cut line, creating little triangle tails at either end. You'll cut your pocket open along the center line until you reach these triangle tips. Then you'll cut from the tip of the triangle to the end of the stitching line, creating a little flap of fabric. Now let's place the pocket. I'm using a friction pin to mark my placement, which can be erased with heat from an iron. I use a sewing gauge to determine that I want the pocket about 2 inches up. The center of the pocket should be aligned on the dart so that it's in the same place on both sides of the front. I mark only the center line for now. This one ended up a shade too high, so I move it down. Before we start the pocket, we have to assemble the pieces. Take one pocket piece and one of the welt pieces and sew the two with right sides together. This will become the bottom of the pocket. Now we'll line up the lower pocket piece with the pocket line on the vest front, making sure to put the fabric with right sides together. Then align the top welt piece with the top edge of the line. At this point, it's hard to see where my stitching line ends, so after the welt pieces are pinned in place, I mark them with my pen, so I know where to stop sewing. Sew the pieces to the front of the vest, according to the seam allowance you picked. For me, that's 1/4 of an inch from my pocket opening line. You'll want to backstitch at the beginning and end of these stitching lines to keep the pocket pieces from pulling apart from the vest. Now I'll mark the corners of my fabric for cutting. I have my template piece handy, so I can see how far in to mark. We'll cut this slit open, careful not to nick the stitches when we cut up into the corners to create those triangle flaps. Then all these pieces get folded to the inside. Once the welt pieces are to the inside, we'll arrange them the way we want them. Take the top flap and pin it up out of the way for now. Then fold the bottom welt piece so that it covers the gap completely, making sure these little triangle flaps stay to the inside of the piece as well. You'll want to adjust this until it's nice and straight and fills the gap completely. When you turn it over to the right side, you'll see what your finished welt pocket should look like. Before we sew this, take it to the ironing board and press everything flat so that it stays exactly where it needs to. This also makes the creases nice and crisp. Now we can fold down the top flap and sew it to the pocket with right sides together. Clip your threads, and now we'll close the sides of the pocket, which will also complete the welt. Pin the sides of the pocket together, and the sides of the welt too, making sure you have the triangle flap pinned so it will be part of this seam. We'll sew in a straight line down this side, putting all of these pieces together. If you need to fold the body fabric back so it doesn't get caught where the triangle is, that's fine. Just make sure your welt stays where you want it. Then sew this closed. You'll sew over the triangle flap and the seam will be flush with the corner of the welt. If it looks good, go ahead and sew both sides. That one shifted a little on me, so I'll need to cut it out and try again. That looks pretty good though. After I fix it, I decide to shorten the pocket a little so it won't be caught in the bottom seam on the vest. It's not really necessary, but the pocket pieces are a little long on purpose, so you can make adjustments to them as you see fit. Now I'll sew the other welt the same way. I'm not really sure how it happened, but despite being made in exactly the same way with the exact same pattern pieces and guidelines, the second welt ended up being a little taller than the first. It isn't really noticeable unless you're looking close though, so I'll leave it for now. Sewing is funny that way. Sometimes you get different results, even when you've made a pattern 100 times. It all depends on the fabric you're using, the thread, even the condition of your needle can affect the outcome. Then we'll finish assembling the outer shell. Pin the shoulders of the vest front to the vest back with right sides together, and sew the shoulder seams, backstitching at both ends of either seam. Clip all your threads and then pick placement for your back ties. I move mine around a bit before I find a place I feel they look good. Then I sew them on, a little less than 1/4 inch from the edge. That way, these initial stitches that are just holding it on won't be visible. As soon as I sew that one down, I realize I put it on upside down. Oops. I want the seam on the bottom, so I turn it over and sew it again. I take the outer fabric to the ironing board. Then it's time to connect the outer shell to the lining. Place the lining and outer fabric with right sides together, and pin around the neckline and down the front edge on both sides. You'll also pin the armholes shut, leaving the sides under the armholes open for now. Once all your pins are in, sew around both armholes, backstitching at both ends. Then backstitch and sew up the front edge of the vest, around the neckline, and then down the other side's front edge, backstitching at the end. Turn the vest right side out by pulling the material through the space between fabric layers in the shoulder. Then give it a light pressing. Next is closing the sides of the vest. Take one side of the garment and put the front and back outer shell fabric with right sides together, and the lining with right sides together too, making sure the seams in the bottom of the armhole line up nicely. Make sure the straps are tucked in between the two layers of the outer shell too. Pin both sides closed this way, and then each side can be sewn shut in a straight line, connecting the lining to itself and the outer shell to itself. Make sure you're happy with both sides before moving on, because the way they lay can only be tweaked now. Clip threads and then we'll close the bottom edge. Fold the garment inside out again, and pin the bottom edge of the lining and the outer shell together, leaving a small gap in the center. I mark mine with my friction pin. We'll only sew up to these lines, leaving an opening in the bottom edge where the garment can be turned. While you can just sew to this point and then backstitch, it can make it easier to line up and close this gap later if you also turn the fabric and sew down off the bottom edge. This creates a join in the hem that will make it stay neatly turned to the inside. Sew the other half of the bottom closed the same way. Then trim the last of your threads and turn the garment right side out again by pulling the fabric out through the gap left in the bottom. You may want to use a pen or pencil to make sure all your corners are turned before we close that bottom gap. To close the opening remaining in the bottom, use a hand needle and thread and sew a hidden stitch. Start by running your needle through the inside of the garment so that your thread knot will be hidden inside. Then take turns putting one small stitch in either piece of fabric to pull them together and create your invisible seam. A stitch in the fabric, a stitch in the lining, a stitch in the fabric, a stitch in the lining. After pressing the vest one last time, it's time to finish the front with buttons. I measure out the distance I want between the buttons and mark them with pins. Then lay the front edges together so I can use my friction pin to mark exactly where the buttonholes should go. If you aren't a fan of making buttonholes, you can always just sew on decorative buttons, and then use snaps for the actual closure. I've got some big silver buttons I've been dying to use on something I can get away with making a little gaudy, so I'll stitch them on and then make buttonholes. My machine's buttonhole function doesn't work very well, so I make mine manually. Sometimes they turn out awesome, and sometimes they're ugly as sin, but they're looking okay today. When opening your buttonholes, it's a good idea to slide a pin through one end of the buttonhole. That way, when you push your seam ripper through the fabric and slice open the buttonhole, your seam ripper will hit the pin at the end and not damage any of your stitches. And there we go! One finished vest for a dapper SID guy, paired with the dress shirt I shared a pattern for a while back. It goes good with my tie pattern too. We'll be making a pair of dress pants to go with these soon, so make sure you're subscribed and check back soon. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.